that you probably want to sort of make, and backed up by a couple of key assumptions, but not this extraneous amount of information that you're trying to fit on that slide. Even with the financial information, I would tend to, instead of putting the whole spreadsheet up there, I would tend to focus on the key elements of the assumptions and kind of the conclusions of the spreadsheet, and then include that, the more details, in a handout. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Now, am I saying you absolutely, with certainty, have to have this beautifully bound document? No. That is your choice, but my suspicion is you're probably going to want to have that extra level of supporting information in there. Okay? Or in a separate document, is what I'm saying.
Like an executive summary.
Well, in other words, let's put it this way. Like, you're probably not going to want to include every little detail from the zoning ordinance in your presentation. You're going to want to include, here we are C2 zoning, here are the uses that we've selected, those are allowable uses. And that would be in your PowerPoint slide. Possibly in your document, you might actually have the zoning ordinance in there with highlighted key component parts that show, that verify that you can indeed have those uses within that zoning classification as backup material. Because what you want to be able to do is, when you're giving the presentation on, let's say, that piece, if one of the folks that's on the judging panel says, well, I don't think you can have that particular use in that zoning, you want to be able to sort of have that document there underlined, showing, yes, I can. Much the same sort of thing like with the market analysis information, that you're saying the rental rates are $30 a square foot, and then they say, well, where did you get that information? You're saying, well, we called a bunch of brokers. That's probably not going to be good enough. You're going to want to have the supporting information within probably a separate document that shows this came from the 2015 study done by Cushman and Wakefield or CBRE or whoever. Does that make sense? Question.
In regards to the zoning, should we stick with what's there?
Yes.
Or because in the handout it said, assuming you can get it.
I would say stick with what's there.
Okay.
You're going to have less resistance because the panel is probably going to say, well, don't you think that's going to take a fair amount of time and additional resources and that sort of thing? I mean, I'm not trying to put a damper on creativity, but I would tend to sort of say, they've already gone through it, and be realistic, because that's also part of what they're trying to say. Being realistic, are we going to really jump through that many more hoops at this point, or are we kind of like, unless there's something that's just absolutely, unbelievably incredible that you are just, for whatever reason, dead set on, that then, I say, well, go for it in that circumstance, but otherwise I would say stick with what's there.
Okay. So no JCC Center?
Right.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Make sense, everybody? Yes? No? Possibly could be? Okay, so what, as I said, what I would start doing, start your background, each individual person can start their background research independent of the group, okay? And start finding out this information. But without question, the people that are doing the site and the regulatory really do have a lot of control as to what flows, forward in terms of what uses are going to be allowable. And if you already know, for example, that you're doing office and you're doing some retail, and you're doing maybe hospitality, well, the market person can go ahead and start collecting that information. Make sense? Okay. But ultimately, you've got to come together at some point and kind of coalesce it to get it all nailed down. Okay. All right. Any other sort of questions?
Just to make sure we are creating our own budget at the end of the day, correct?
What, sorry?
We are creating our own budget.
Yes.
At the end of the day.
Yep. The one piece of information I think they gave you was the land cost of like 12.8 million. Okay. So that right there, starts you off and kind of knowing that's the baseline. But to that, what are going to be your construction costs? Okay. And Mancini should be able to help you out with that in terms of data information. The construction costs. Okay. All right. Now, Everybody good? All right, what I want to do, unless you guys are just really opposed to it, is probably not do lunch until, and we'll do 30 minutes for lunch around 2 o'clock. Is that going to be okay? 1:30?
All right.
Well, but you know how it is. The moment you do lunch, you're going to come back and you're all sleepy, and I don't want that. So I want to try to push off lunch as long as possible.
Are we playing with Legos today?
We're going to be
I'm
playing with
going to be
Legos.
excited regardless. So that's my thing.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. All right, if everybody's good with the NAOP thing, everybody good?
Yeah.
Feel comfortable with that? All right, so now what I want you to do, the second piece, which I have not yet talked about, which we're going to talk about, is the urban plan. Okay, this is a case study that was developed by the Urban Land Institute a few years ago that focuses in on effectively redeveloping a blighted area of town and some of the issues that you face as a developer whenever you go into a blighted area of town and try to redevelop that area. Now, we're going to talk about it, and obviously get to play with Legos and get to play with site plans and all this other wonderful stuff. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about some of these issues and kind of get some of these things kind of out in the open of whenever you talk about this course being effectively site planning, or land use planning and project design, you're going to get bits and pieces of that from both of these projects, okay? The idea of land use planning is what? Is how do you go about determining what the uses are going to be on a particular piece of land, all right? So how would you think that you go about doing that? Because obviously that's what your site person is being asked to do. So what are the kinds of things that you think you would do to start out that process of figuring out what to put on a vacant piece of land?
Just kind of look at the surrounding neighborhood, see, you
Okay,
know, we
maybe-
don't want to put
To what extent maybe it fits in within the
industrial,
neighborhood?
you know, middle
Absolutely.
of a residential, or, so, I mean, you can start immediately crossing things off the list that would absolutely not go there.
Okay.
You can go to zoning and just start
Right,
processing.
and so what we were just talking about, that regulatorily, you may be constrained as to what you can do. But what if, you're starting maybe, you're almost designing a fresh city, where ultimately you've got a blank slate of an area that you're building a master plan community. What kinds of things are you going to be thinking about whenever you're putting together that land use plan?
what the community needs.
What the community needs, what the sort of the layout, the topography of the land, and what kinds of features are already there, present on the land. Are there water features that you can potentially take advantage of? Who is going to potentially benefit the most from those? Those kinds of things. What else? Are there any sort of environmental issues that you've got to be concerned about? In terms of was this at some point had some sort of toxic waste stored on the site? Anything that you've got to be concerned about, obviously in terms of wetlands. Obviously here in Florida, big issue. Do you have endangered species that potentially reside on this land currently that would preclude you from being able to build on that land? Or if you do build on that land, are you going to have to go through a process of wetland mitigation banking and potentially find parcels of land off-site that you can potentially migrate these animals to and then ultimately be able to build on the land that you want to build on? Okay, so those are going to be concerns as well. What else? What other kinds of issues are going to be? What about,
Density?
Density, absolutely. Do you want this to be more of a typical sort of bedroom community in terms of low density, big lot sizes, or do you want it to be more of a high density kind of, very close proximity of people living next door to each other? And part of the thing that's going to be driving that is what? Probably your cost of land. Okay? If you've got virtually free land in the sense that the cost is really low, you can do low density without too much difficulty. Thus, take a look at Texas. In Texas, you've got a lot of these master plan communities with these massive residential lots, and part of the reason they can afford to do that is because land is cheap there. Okay? Here in Florida, not so much, okay? A little bit of a higher density. As you get into a downtown area, even more density, more expensive land, which forces you to have to increase the height and to try to maximize the value of the land. So there are those sort of competing interests. So what about within an urban area? Like if we were wanting to take this area and redevelop, what are going to be maybe some of the other issues that we would face in a land use planning sort of an environment?
Parking.
Okay, accessibility, parking, but what else? What about some of the social elements? I'm sorry?
Amenities.
Okay, amenities,
Opposition.
Views.
view corridors,
Opposition from the community.
opposition. Okay, who's going to oppose your development? And not necessarily just in this urban context, but who are some of the different types of groups that are potentially going to oppose you whenever you're trying to develop your land use plan? Environmentalists, basically saying, don't cut down the trees, don't, disturb the animals, you can't build here. Okay, who else?
Existing residents.
Okay, existing residents that basically say, I don't want anything built in my backyard. The whole NIMBY thing, not in my backyard. Okay, that they don't want you there because they're perfectly happy with the size of their community and what maybe amenities they currently have. They don't want to share them with anybody else. And so there are definitely big issues with that. Also, they don't necessarily want a bunch of construction going on that's going to disturb their sleep. Issues that you have to deal with on that. What else?
Some low-income families.
Okay, you're going to have to deal potentially with low-income groups or maybe churches or social service sort of groups that are demanding workforce housing or low-income housing or affordable housing, whatever word you want to attach to it, and ultimately, how is that going to impact what you build? Okay, who else potentially is going to interplay in that process? The government, absolutely. And just because the zoning says that you can build this doesn't inherently mean that you're going to get the full, complete support of the government officials associated with giving you the final approval to actually build what it is that you've set out to build. That is why, what did you see this morning that they emphasized about a dozen times? Do not contact the local government officials associated with this particular NAIOP project. Because one phone call from one of you to a local official, even if it's the best intentioned phone call and just sort of saying, hey, I'm looking at this site and I've got a couple of questions about the zoning and whether the C2 zoning will allow me to do this or that, and then the next thing you know, it turns into something that's much more monstrous, okay? So that, without question, big issue, okay? Who else?
Competing properties.
Competing properties. You may have other folks that are already there that don't want you, okay? They want to exclude, there maybe already be enough hotels within that area, and so the owners of those other hotels are saying, hey, we don't want any more competition, so therefore we're going to do everything we can to make your progress in this, difficult, okay? So those are the kinds of sort of swirling, issues that you've got. Well, that is where the urban plan sort of steps in. Effectively, each member of your group is going to kind of represent one of those types of groups, okay? And ultimately, in helping you to decide how to lay out, effectively, your redevelopment plan, okay? And, issues like low-income housing, issues like, should we tear down the building or should we effectively try to adaptively reuse it? Folks in the community that are concerned about, once again, the existing residents that are concerned about maybe construction or, whatever it might be, but then also the developer's perspective of, I've got to make this project financially feasible, so, what do I have to do in order to make that work? Now, all of this sort of stems from, to a certain extent, whenever local governments start this initial process of what is referred to as creating their land use plan, they get a lot, or they're supposed to get a lot of community input from all of those different competing interests. And ideally, everyone, hopefully comes to some sort of consensus as to, how it's going to sort of look and feel and that sort of thing. But the reality, as probably several of you, already understand, is it's not a clean and simple process. Sometimes you get lucky as a developer. You're able to go into a local government that has this big parcel of land that is available, and they pretty much give you carte blanche to do anything and everything you want to do on that property and lay it out how you want to with virtually no resistance whatsoever. But then other instances of where you buy a parcel of land that is perfect for the kind of project that you want to build, but you get immense resistance for no real good, solid, compelling reason other than you have a handful of people that don't want it, okay? But the idea, theoretically, is behind this land use plan, you bring all these competing interests together and you come up with, through a series of, what typically are referred to as like charrettes or sort of these kind of studios of giving people kind of an idea of how we want this community to look. How do we want it to be laid out? What sort of features do we want? What kind of atmosphere do we want? Do we want it to be a walkable community? Do we want it to be a community where we have to hop in the car and drive wherever we want to go? How much landscaping do we want to require of the individual properties? In other words, how much regulation do we want to place upon the developer? Okay, so those are all sort of competing issues. So here's what we're going to do. The first piece of this urban plan is a little questionnaire. All right, and so what we're going to do is we're going to start with that. Okay, and this initially is to be an individual sort of assignment. Initially, I want you to fill it out on your own initially, and then you're going to get in your groups and talk about it a little bit. And once you finish this, take a 5-minute break. The last person that finishes it doesn't get a break.
Yeah. What?
This is about like where we live.
Right. Read the directions. And clearly the most important questions are the ones on the back. And once you've got it, just keep it. And once you've finished, you can take a 5-minute break, and once again, the last person to finish doesn't get a break.
Fans are a lifesaver.
Yeah, having felt so good all
So
day.
that access space was nice and cool when we went and visited.
Yeah, that was great.
How's that going, by the way?
The advisory board didn't want us with the money.
Is it that much more than here?
About 3 times as much.
Of course.
That's the reason why we invited them to get this.
Really?
Uniform. Or, well, second summer, whatever it is.
Summer 2 or
Yeah, try to get that. Yeah.
I
At least they're 100 official.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a problem with that either. You know?
Yeah.
I think campus is there for a reason.
Just 15 more minutes to my drive.
Luckily, I won't have to go back over there. That takes me 10 minutes to get back. So the bulk of my travel time to get to this space right here is coming
Around the
from the,
boulevard.
no, it's coming from the parking lot. That's the bulk of my travel time.
Right.
Getting up there and then finally
Yeah.
down here.
San Miguel said we can't use this to take notes. He said no laptops.
No electronics.
So Mancini and I both have this. I'm like, hey, this is what I use to take notes. He goes, no.
It's character, that definitely.
And I kind of want to know what's going to happen if I say, hey, I know the policy, I'm taking the risk. You know, you can yell at me if I'm being disrupted by looking at, you know, Facebook or something during class, but you can tell me what to learn, but not how to learn.
You take your 2% of participation.
I know, he'll take it off every
2% participation you'll
I
lose
said no electronics.
right off the top. It's not like you can keep you out of class. So
Well,
you can do it.
that's exactly what are the consequences.
Yeah. You just lose that 2% every time.
Yeah, that's his discretionary percentage to give me.
Yeah. This got me really.
So this must be what it was like in the 1940s or 50s before air conditioning.
Yeah, right.
Life was hard. Man.
Yes.
They used to
At
have.
least there you could open the windows.
Yeah.
You know.
They used to have these big blocks of ice.
Yeah, everybody gets to sit on a block.
I did. And they said, but he said they were out there working on it. So
They are.
something must be wrong.
You can actually see them out there working on it.
Something must be wrong with it.
Yeah. It's not that it's just not turned on. That's not the issue. It's something wrong with it.
Yeah, I went down there this morning and they said, all right, we'll turn it on. And give it about 30 minutes.
Yeah. No, I went there twice, and then it was after that I went and bought the fans. I was just like, have at least some airflow.
Yeah.
Something. Okay.
What?
Honestly, chill.
What? You just swole the other day?
Yeah.
Just get rid.
I'm in the process.
Yeah. I'm doing the baby curls.
There was one in particular. It's a press that you gotta do. Should put the hell out of that shit. They always say, don't work, don't work.
Well, me too.
Kind of creepy, but whatever.
What's that?
It's kind of creepy, but
Yeah.
whatever.
I don't care.
Who's that?
Okay. Kind of wondering. Stealing one of the other. You want to switch to either one of the other teams, Robert?
Urban 3, I'll do.
Should have somebody going.
He's trying to put me
Trying to
on
tell you
one.
on one.
That's what he's trying to keep. But yeah,
Okay.
sure. I'll do. Either Urban 3 or Urban 1. Preferably. Urban 3.
I'm going to show you the email that Matt Martin sent to me. It said
That was all.
85.
Correct.
I can't even pronounce some of his names.
There's another online class before
I
that.
don't know.
How can I work?
5875.
Can't even say
Right.
the name.
You see.
I'm being traded already. Traded already.
We're doing the French right?
I didn't. I just found the
Season ain't even started yet, and they're trying to trade me.
See if you can do it on Monday.
So now I have to switch this one, which is the wrong 5.
Well, no,
The
you can.
wrong one.
You're gonna have to do that one.
Shouldn't have a no trade clause on the first 30 days.
We'll just see if we can switch them.
Right, exactly.
No, you're right.
So, but I'll still want to meet with you on Wednesday.
I thought I wrote it.
You wrote that for the accounting class, and they still haven't done that yet.
Nothing?
Nothing. Nothing. And I haven't, I've spoken to her, she was very good. Spoken to the accounting class, and he told me he would pay assignment. As I said, Tuesday, and I did the Wall Street Journal.
All right. Call me first thing Monday morning, and we'll get everything resolved.
I just feel, you know how I feel, right? I just feel like,
Once again, I am the only person that can do anything.
no, I didn't know that.
Well, now you do.
Because Matt is medical.
Matt is the person who gets you into the program. I'm the person who takes care of you while you're in it.
So I'll just do it.
Foggy's the man. He's the man with the master plan.
Okay, come on, everybody get back. What are we missing?
Dustin is out on the full show.
So why is the hallway cool and it's not cool in here? That's what I want to know.
It's because all these computers are on.
Yeah, even so, that doesn't, I mean, it shouldn't make that much of a difference. I mean,
Body heat.
okay, all right. So here's what we're going to do. Effectively, we've got individual responsibilities that each of your team members are going to play. Here are the different 5 roles that we have. You can choose to be the city liaison, which is basically, if you want to sort of think about it in the terms that we were just talking about, on the regulatory side of things, okay? The marketing director, kind of the market analysis piece. Financial analysis, the neighborhood liaison, so that's kind of the missing piece from the previous project, and then the site planner. So think about which of these 5 roles that you want to be for the urban plan project, all right? And then what we will do is we will go ahead and what I want you to do now is to break up into your urban plan teams.
We got to number 3.
Okay, what I want you to do now is to break up into your urban plan teams. And the first thing I want you to do is to talk a little bit about your individual responses to the questionnaire, but focus really on the last 3 questions on the back page, okay? So once again, break up into your urban plan groups.
Are you switching me to another group or?
Just stay where you are.
Should have got text from me. No, Dustin.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, what was your first name? Okay, right.
Okay, once again, break into your urban plan groups
Urban group?
Yeah.
and talk a little bit about your responses within your group on the question sheet. Then once you've done that, then figure out who among you wants to take on these respective roles. It's a project.
Project, yeah.
Legos.
But like the classroom project?
Yes.
Just for today or for?
All semester.
Okay.
We keep our Legos on some film.
No.
I always wondered where that picture came from on the website. I'm like, are we ever gonna do that? This is it?
This is it.
Okay.
Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Let's see. So, what kind of place would we like to live, and why? Actually, I really like the neighborhood I live in. So So essentially, it's got a good neighborhood feel, an active, engaged community, plenty of parks, green space, really good amenities. There's boat slips, boat launch ramp, walking distance. Yeah. It's not canals all the way to the The only thing, the kind of place I would like to live in Hawaii is the same kind of neighborhood, but with a little bit more like retail, food, restaurants, and areas to socialize. Well, so residential neighborhood, but walking or biking distance to like a main street type of feel.
I put.
Oh, that was this one.
I just put the Caribbean Island. Just because I like the laid back. I like the open space. I like not a lot of traffic. But I like all the like eco stuff, like scuba diving, we like cities, but and I also like the sense of community. You kind of lose that when you're in it. Probably Nago with the islands. So we have to have that heavy formal. Because again, with Miami, it's not so much the housing that's not affordable, it's just like, tolls. Car insurance is more money, more cars get stolen. And I think a place that kind of has all of this is Tallahassee. Because it's kind of like laid back. It's a lot of open space. Maybe not so much like the eco activities like scuba diving, but forestry. They have the government there, the employment center. Pays well for considering the town that we're in. And it's like, I don't know, just like more community. Like when the students are gone, the government officials are gone, it's really small community.
Mine, I like to live in like more residential community. I feel more comfortable at home. And for much residential and good environment, good location, good surrounding schools, a lot of landscaping vegetation, good common areas and parks. And well, let's see, we'll be like west.
What city?
Weston.
Western is my
Weston is, yeah.
I've driven through there, but I've never been to smell that. It's basically a huge land city. So it's like a master plan city. Got it.
For me, it's funny that you spoke about the Caribbean because I was comparing that. So for me, I like spacious. I grew up on the island, it's also in the water. 4 acres, so we are very spacious. I still like it, which I do like. But then I lack the necessities of recreation. The only thing there is to swim and the gas station. We took it all the way up to the community. Hospitals are not the landscape. Think of the things like and I like that sector on the me. I like that and I like how it's supposed to be. As far as the hospitals, schools, everything has its own neighborhood. So that would be my ideal reading. I don't know where here. Maybe I'm
You're like 100% Canadian. Your parents born there. Really? So it's like generations.
Oh, so this is the basis of that we've got.
just like 6 months.
I put that on my paper too.
Costco's right here.
Yeah, which is my favorite filling one.
Oh, yeah?
No, it is. I think people want to
Okay, it sounds like everybody's kind of gone through their ideal sort of neighborhood in terms of where they would like to live and kind of what sort of features. I've been hearing the discussion, so it's up, so give me a consensus of some of the things that you guys have sort of discussed about what is a kind of an ideal sort of situation. Okay, Robert, you have one?
Y'all want everyone get ready to give a little tear here?
Let me stand up.
Can you work with the hood?
I want to live somewhere where I am comfortable, somewhere with a good mix of people, and one that I know my children can be raised safely with access to opportunity.
There we go.
I like that.
Okay, so what about, so that gives an element of sort of the social dynamics, but what about the aesthetic aspect? Anybody?
We did use design, unique design. We mentioned parking, and it has to be adequate parking. We don't have to pay $20 to park somewhere.
But in terms of your ideal place to live,
Lots of green space.
okay, lots of green space, what else?
That old Europe, Caribbean style.
Good surrounding schools.
Vacation looking.
Okay, so, all right, you want to feel like you're always on vacation, I don't like that. Okay, what else? Other attributes of your ideal? Okay, low crime rates.
Cars, schools.
Cars, schools.
Yeah.
Okay, so all sorts of amenities, okay? Transportation
Yeah,
possibilities.
close to things you'd like to do and
Okay, so one of the, I guess the last questions was, okay, so what community or what area has all these things that you want, other than where you are now? What did you guys buy?
And last,
I put Costa Rica.
Aventura?
I put Costa Rica.
Costa Rica? What else?
I put Tallahassee.
Tallahassee. Tallahassee.
Clear Park.
What, I'm sorry?
Clear Park.
Okay.
You did
I just pointed out that I don't know the areas, but a lot of times the cities that have a religious instance tend to have the best neighborhoods.
Green? Okay. Yeah.
I put Cistro.
All right. Well, one of the interesting points that Robert just made, and we've talked maybe a little bit about this before, but you said, located in an area that has a great school system, and a lot of times that then parallels with, the area being a nice area, for families and that sort of thing. And, we've talked about in the past, do you think that's going to change? Do you think that now with more and more parents saying, we're going to do online education with our kids and homeschooling and that sort of thing, to what extent, does that then free them up from having to live in a, quote unquote, good school district? Now they can just simply live where they want to live. And, what implications, potentially does that have for developers?
I don't think it'll take hold just yet, because there's still a long ways to go before it gains that acceptance. Online schooling.
In today's society, most dual parent households both are working, so who's going to teach the kids? So
Well, in most of those arrangements, from what I understand, is that a lot of times it ends up still being like a community group. That there's, someone that kind of, it's not inherently that just the parents are taking the responsibility. It's a shared responsibility, among a group of parents, and that maybe one of those parents can kind of de facto sort of be the teacher, if you will, but ultimately, schedule, events and whether it's sports or, other recreation related kinds of things with, groups of people. And, it's interesting because, part of the motivation is, well, first of all, if your school district is lousy, it's a way to, get your kids out of that lousy situation, whether it's the quality of the education or maybe it's just it's even a safety issue. That might be, an answer. But, even in some of the nicest neighborhoods, you may simply, for whatever reason, want to pull your kids out and go through the process of educating yourself.
As a parent,
Well-
I wouldn't have, I don't know.
Yeah, me too.
I don't think that.
It's interesting because, whenever I was into this, I've been cited for several years, I think, you know, and every time I bring it up, it seems to gain a little bit more momentum. And I've had several parents that have told me they have done just that. This past week at one of the conferences that I went to, someone else brought it up. It wasn't me this time. And literally almost the whole table was talking about, yeah, we did that, our neighbors did that, you know, so I think, you know, it's the sort of thing that, you know, it's definitely, it's gaining a lot more momentum, I think, than people really realize, because, like, companies like Pearson Education have developed, you know, these full and complete curriculums that are available in an online format that, you pretty much can, you know, send the kid, you know, off to be able to do this at home, and you know, the only reason I bring it up is just simply because of your point. You know, but I think, yes, absolutely, historically, school districts have made a huge impact on the neighborhood stability and the quality and that sort of thing. But if you remove that, you know, then all of a sudden, you know, does that change the shape of things dramatically? Because, you know, obviously with the millennials, you know, that's all everyone talks about is how, you know, these folks are sort of evolving and changing and saying, we don't inherently want to even have cars, we want to live in downtown, we want to, you know, potentially even raise kids in a downtown urban environment, and we can do so because we can, and not even have to worry about the school district because we're going to self-educate them at home, you know, all kinds of interesting swirling, you know, issues out there. So certainly something to think about. Okay, so other kind of interesting insights out of the questionnaire. Part of what it was meant to do is just to get you to start thinking about some of these issues, okay? The things you're writing down, things that you know, like, for example, one of the first questions, you know, they asked you was, you know, in your neighborhood where you live, you know, is there a building or a property that sort of stands out that's an eyesore, you know, and you know, potentially what might you know, see that you would want them to do with that property? You know, also giving an example of what it is the ideal maybe sort of property within your neighborhood. It's all about you beginning to kind of develop the context of what is it that you're sort of looking for, what kind of neighborhood, what kind of an environment makes sense to you and ideally you want. And what hopefully you're hearing, there's no 100% consistency. You know, some people are saying, you know, they want, you know, more of a Caribbean feel, maybe somebody else wants more of a completely urban feel, somebody else wants more of a very traditional kind of you know, feels in the neighborhood. And so you know, those sorts of things have to be kind of realized that it's like no one size fits all, okay? So, all right, everybody fairly comfortable with the responses everybody? Okay, so the second piece of this one's a little bit quicker. What actually makes a good place to live? Okay, another quick, this is a one-pager, and this is pretty simple. It's just a few words you got to give, and also use some ranking. This shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. You read it. Just started. Okay. So at this point, everybody done? Okay. So let's take a look at this. So obviously, part of this whole assignment is about the trade-offs that exist. And so this is sort of start with the first set of questions. If you had to decide today, which would you say is more important for development to emphasize? Those being jobs, parking, or parks, and then a strong tax base. So let's start with the jobs, all right, or housing. Which one would you say?
Commercial development.
Okay, oh, one at a time. Okay, Brian?
Yeah, commercial development, because the more jobs you have, the more commercial development, you strengthen your tax base, which supports different things that attract more people, which will support the housing.
Okay.
Same thing I prefer for her.
Okay, anybody else something different? Yep, Robert.
I actually chose not to answer that one because I felt that, not because I didn't want to do it, but I felt that it really depends on the community's needs, so to speak. If you're in a blighted community, you start throwing commercial development that takes away from the residents. However, if you're choosing to upgrade the community, you need to go with housing. It has to be a mix. It's hard to put a, let's go commercial, because then you're wiping out the community itself.
Right.
So
You have a whole issue of displacement.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden you come in, you buy up all the slum housing, let's say, and then move all those folks out, where are they gonna go?
Yeah.
You know, you may build some nice stuff to replace it, but it's going to be servicing the people that were there. Okay?
So we technically answer this.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing.
Anybody else have a little bit of a different perspective on it?
I say housing because of the population increase. We learned that it's gonna double or triple, so we're gonna need housing.
I think housing also leads to the commercial use as well. We build commercial office or in the day, use it for
Right. You gotta have both. And I think ultimately it's a balance. Yeah. Okay? Yes. Retail follows rooftops.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So the second one, parks or parking.
Yes. You gotta have parking on parks.
Okay.
I went with parks.
I love the parks.
I said the parks create the meeting place for the community. It also gives that community like a sense of unity.
I said that it depends because if you're in a city that's walkable, then having park space is going to be important. You still need the balance. But if you're in the suburbs, all you have parks, there's no place to park other than the pickup. So.
The parking in the parks.
Okay. And then the last one, a strong tax base so the city can provide the services to its residents, or affordable housing so middle and low income people can afford to live there.
I went with a strong tax base. Basically, I just felt like you need a strong tax base in order for the city to properly meet the needs of the community. Again, it goes back to saying,
So trickle down economics.
yeah, kind of, you need that strong tax base so that the community do what it's supposed to do.
Create an attractive community, a place that people want to go and live.
Well, it says it in the question. So the city provides services to its residents. So,
Yeah.
and you need that in order to even get a affordable housing. Right?
Well, I mean,
To a point.
to a point, I mean, but if you assume that some affordable housing is government subsidized or government effectively paid for, maybe fully, could you have an entire community that's nothing but effectively government paid for housing? Is that inherently, the kind of community you want to do it?
I think you want less government.
Yeah.
Less
That's
government,
in the project.
less less services, less tax base, will make it a more affordable community.
All right. So we're going to obviously swirl around these issues a lot more with this, but let's go ahead and move on down to the priorities. So what they ask you to do is kind of on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being the least important priority, 10 being the most important, even though there may be 5 of them. How important, or at least it allows you some flexibility in being able to say which one is really important to you and which one's not. How important do each, or do you think that each of the following should be on trying to revitalize a neighborhood? So sort of take these sort of one at a time, and I'm going to kind of just type in your number for each one, just to kind of see how much variation there is among the class. So starting with the first one, the redevelopment must include uses that consumers will demand and support financially. On a scale from 1 to 10, how important is that? With 10 being the most important. We'll start up here.
8.
Okay. Oops. Okay.
7, 7, 7.
I also went 7.
Okay.
8.
Laura? Okay.
8.
9.
Nine.
2 9s.
Okay.
2 10s and 1 9.
Okay.
You guys cheat over there.
All right. Moving on. Okay. The redevelopment must be able to provide a reasonable profit to the developer so that the developer can attract investors willing to risk their money in the project.
4.
I put 9.
No wrong answers, guys.
No wrong answers. Okay, what?
5.
Yeah.
10.
It's either a 1 or a 10.
Okay. Robert?
6 10s back in.
But if you just design something profitable,
Oh, wait.
5
4
10s,
6
so
8.
5 10s and an 8.
Okay.
Huh?
7.
We picked up an extra one
We
there
have more
somewhere.
people.
Okay. Next one, the redevelopment should beautify its surroundings and be well designed architecturally and spatially. Okay, sort of here. Okay, 8.
9.
8.
7. 10.
10.
4.
What?
Yeah.
7.
9.
Okay.
9.
Good. One more.
So somebody in the first one didn't say.
All right. The next one, the redevelopment should not cause the city government to lose money.
2.
3.
2.
5. Won't care about 2. 7.
7.
I went 7 as
Well,
well.
the government will figure it out.
6. Shaq, Roy. Stay focused.
Okay, who else hasn't answered?
7.
5.
7.
I didn't. I said 2.
I asked at 8.
Okay. Everybody?
That's too much.
Okay. And then the last one, the redevelopment should respond to the concerns of the neighborhood where it is to be located. Okay.
9.
9.
8.
9.
8.
6.
8.
I went 8.
What?
8.
No.
7.
8.
5.
9.
Interesting. Okay. Definitely got some outliers there, but it looks like that. Interesting.
Someone keeps missing.
Yeah, a couple of people are missing here.
We all want the same shoes.
So let's just sort of take these sort of one by one real quickly. All right, so the redevelopment must include uses that consumers will demand and support financially. Okay, so what's the compelling interest here?
The developers, they have to build something that people can handle and pay.
Okay, but it's an appropriate use based upon the market demand.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that you're building, once again, what basically is missing from the market, hopefully that is not already there, or it's not maybe the right mix, so, okay.
I feel like that's exactly correlated with the development concerns in the neighborhood. I feel like it's almost.
Oh, it is, absolutely. Yeah, and that's part of, I think, what this is really trying to sort of get you guys to do, is to sort of think, it is all intertwined.
Yeah.
You know, but yet, some of the times, the needs of the neighborhood go beyond that aspect, and then flow over into more social sort of, components, or, whatever else, there may be. And it's sort of, it's kind of like, you may have an ally on this issue, but not necessarily on this issue.
On the supply and demand side, now, I've heard this before. In some cases, aren't you creating
Demand.
the demand?
In some cases, absolutely. If you're building something, hoping it'll come, and it's something maybe new, different, Absolutely. Creating demand.
Or creating the market almost.
But you're also identifying the consumers that are using that demand you're creating.
Okay, so moving on to the second one, the redevelopment must provide a reasonable profit to the developer so the developer can attract investors and willing to risk their money into the project. I would expect that most everybody in this room obviously feels pretty strongly about that one. But yeah, I mean, but here's the thing. Let's take the opposite perspective for a moment. Would you not agree that many people look at developers as being greedy, evil people? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. But the reality is, obviously, in order for the developer to pursue a project, there has to be some level of profit involved or some sort of government subsidy that makes it financially viable.
Yeah, it goes back to that little amount that we went to, in terms of no one's going to invest in an area that developer who actually tried to, develop isn't making a profit and that continues to grow on itself. I mean, it's just, so it's,
No, I see this over and over and over again with redevelopment projects where that you simply are not able to spend the money necessary to even acquire the property, let alone to redevelop the property, and then begin to charge the rental rate that's necessary in order for it to be financially useful. So it just sits there until maybe somebody at some point, it gets condemned, it ultimately gets torn down, or somebody dies and they allow the property to be sold at a more reasonable rate, or it gets foreclosed on. There's all these other manner of reasons as to why, that may actually finally take place. But the reality is it's probably not going to ever be built unless, obviously, there's a profit in this. Or at least the perception is a profit.
You also have those legacy developers, which may not necessarily be looking for a profit. They just want to create something. Say maybe they grew up in that community.
Absolutely. No, and I would agree with that. I've seen a couple of those where you have the multi-millionaire, billionaire folks that are saying, hey, here's something we want to create for the community, and it really isn't about the profit. It's about creating something just to get back to the community. So yeah, that does exist, but
you can't depend on it.
you can't really depend on it. Okay? All right. The third one, the redevelopment should beautify its surroundings and be well designed architecturally and spatially. Now, this is obviously kind of an interesting one because there's no question, if you, at least in my mind, that you're probably going to spend a fair amount of money enforcing higher standards for an area for architectural quality. Now, architects, I think, would argue a little bit that they can do a fair number of things they can to make something visually appealing without maybe having to spend a lot of money. And I do believe in some cases that's possible, but in most instances it really does tend to be a more expensive proposition in order for something to be well designed architecturally and sort of spatial. As a general rule, I mean there are always exceptions, but for the most part that is a real challenge. What do you guys think about that?
Say, hey, if you're going to be creative, if you're going to put your signature on anything, it should always be 100%.
It should always look nice. Whether it has to be like the most ornate, doesn't matter. It's gotta increase the aesthetic appeal of the area.
It's going to be financially feasible.
Friendly,
Go ahead. What is it?
environmentally friendly,
Okay.
sustainable, those aspects as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
But another aspect that would be beyond environmentally sustainable would be durable.
Durable.
Because you obviously design something that looks great initially, but how does it age over time? In terms of does it really start to fall apart after a couple of years? Being exposed to the elements. Okay, so that would be another piece to sort of think about.
Those highly landscape projects, what happens if you're not really trying to cut costs on landscape? And it just goes
Yeah, as opposed to maybe designing it, even though you have a lot of landscaping, is it something to be virtually more of like a xeriscaping, that doesn't require maybe as much sort of routine maintenance, it's kind of more natural. Okay. All right. Next one, the redevelopment, and obviously several people didn't quite like this one. The redevelopment should not cause the city government to lose money. Well, theoretically, governments aren't in the business of making money to begin with. However, one has to think about their financial wherewithal and financial stability, because that is going to impact their ability to borrow money to build public projects, whether it's roads, whether it's public infrastructure. And so if you have a city that is financially strapped, their bond rating is going to be really low, which means they're going to have difficulty borrowing money at a reasonable rate. Therefore, you're going to have a higher cost of infrastructure that's going to ultimately be passed on to you. So don't necessarily think about we're going to starve the city in the sense of not giving them any money whatsoever, and that's going to solve all our problems. Yep.
I think it is different between like short term and long term. Sometimes in short term they have to lose a little bit of their income, but in the long term it's going to build up the development. So there's other positive aspects where they'll end up generating more money.
What would be an example of them losing money? Like other than putting like a church there or something?
No, that would be an example, because the church don't pay property tax.
Right. But what other, like, you're taking down an office?
Well, maybe
But,
you're putting in a use that doesn't generate as much tax revenue as another use. Church is extreme because it doesn't generate any.
Right.
But, a lot of nonprofit-ish uses in many cases don't generate the property tax revenue. I'm not sure how Florida does this compared to Texas, but if you are a purely not-for-profit business located in an office tower that you own, you don't have to pay property taxes. Now here, I don't know if that's the same in Florida or not, but
You're exempt from the sales tax.
right. But in any event, that is one issue. Another is what level of infrastructure a local government may have to provide relative to the use that is being proposed. For example, if you have a very high density residential use, it uses a lot of water, uses a lot of sewer, it's going to require you to have to, as a city, to put in additional infrastructure to support that extra density. That could be initially kind of a losing proposition for the city relative to more of like an office block or retail facility that doesn't require maybe as much.
But would the developer be paying impact fees on?
Well, that's a whole other issue that, yes, if development impact fees are in place, then that hopefully issue is resolved. But keep in mind, not everywhere in the U.S. requires development impact fees.
Just a quick side note, if as a city or municipality, why would they ever want to allow somebody to put a church up?
Once again, it's a neighborhood kind of concern. It's not like, for example, like a mission. A church may be present, they want to have it's a community service.
I'm not against religion. I'm just saying.
No,
So put adjacency.
It's an excellent point. It really is an absolutely excellent point, because imagine a community, just for a moment, let's take the extreme for just a second. Okay? There's not, meant to be a negative thing, but just imagine the extreme for a second. Let's say that your community has a state university, has a gazillion churches, has a whole bunch of nonprofits, has a whole bunch of government uses. And to a certain extent, that is a disaster. In one sense, from a local government's perspective, because they're not going to be receiving property tax revenue from pretty much any of those uses, and those uses could be a fairly significant burden on the community. So there needs to be, theoretically, a balance. That you would not have a predominant number of those uses that would unfairly burden or strain the community. On the flip side, you theoretically could have a community that's nothing but basically shopping districts and office buildings that's generating a ton of tax revenue and not requiring nearly as many maybe city services.
I don't know if you know anything about the Church of Latter-day Saints, but they're buying expensive real estate in Miami and putting up churches. And I'm wondering, on this King Boulevard, there's one on Miami Beach. Prime real estate for churches. So let me interested in.
No, from the city's perspective, they're not going to be getting that tax revenue. So, they're, I'm not saying they're going to be against it, but it's certainly something that they're probably not going to be rah, rah, rah. We really want, to have that happen.
You want this property line, waterfront property built church.
So the same way there's zoning that maybe disallows certain uses that.
Yeah, and
Is there zoning that
yeah,
disallows
churches typically, historically, have been allowed into residential districts. And the idea is there's, along with schools, that it's kind of like, those are historically like compatible uses. But once again, the local government could obviously exclude, a whole number of uses. And they can control this in a variety of different ways. I mean, one city in Texas required, while they may have a zoning ordinance that says, here are the potentially allowable uses, what they require is a conditional use permit to be applied for every time that someone comes in with an idea. So even though your land may be zoned office, they say, you want to build an office there? You still got to come to us and get a conditional use permit to allow you to build an office. So it's not a guarantee. It's just, this is an allowable use, but we're not necessarily going to automatically allow it.
Also, but you have to get a vote or something as well in the past.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of times, once again, you can go for a rezoning, and obviously if you get the community support, and that's another interesting thing is, who turns out at these sort of, public hearings? Usually it's the neighborhood folks, not, inherently the business-minded folks or, other, groups to community basis. It's the sort of neighborhood folks. So those are certainly things to kind of consider. Okay. And I guess it was pretty much the last one we're responding to. They've got concerns in the neighborhood as to where it seems to be located. Any other final thoughts on that?
Take into consideration. I mean, it's got to, if you're going to be seen as anything other than keeping the road.
Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So here's the plan. What I want you to do, I'm going to give you one more handout, and we're going to lunch. I promise. Okay? For 30 minutes. Okay? This handout basically identifies kind of the responsibilities of each of the roles that are to be played. What kind of questions you need to answer in that role. And believe it or not, I think some of this information will be very useful to you on your day out project because there's a lot of overlap. Okay, so just sort of take a look at this. The last thing we're going to do before we go to lunch for 30 minutes is we're going to go ahead and identify who is going to be what in your team. So take a look at this handout real quick. Look at the respective roles and kind of what they're going to be responsible for answering. And then look at the following pages of the kind of questions they're going to be responsible for answering.
How does the team of 6 compare?
You guys have to have somebody that overlaps. Once you have selected your respective roles, you're free to go on your lunch for 30 minutes.
Hey, already. I'm City.
You decided already?
Oh. No, well.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so I just read through the city goal, jump objectives, and then you have the development plan committed, you have the profit to expect from redevelopment, and you have the development proposal, there's a marketing for the characteristics of the housing in this particular district, and then types of businesses. I imagine that's on the list. If you're interested in that.
I said Mancino, volunteers.
Oh, yeah.
All right, let's get somebody gonna do.
I'm gonna end up leaving after lunch. I haven't left one class yet.
So basically, city,
Huh?
I've been working together.
I got charged, listen to them, walk in the back of the head. Okay, yeah, you might
I'm gonna get a green tea and
Okay.
caffeine, so hopefully for system, but if I don't,
Yeah, I understand.
I really appreciate it.
So you want to
I hate this
keep
last name. You're my
Robert?
Robert. You doing marketing?
I don't want to do
Ideally, you probably should pick something different than what you pick on the other project, so you can learn something different.
Did you say your last name? Dada? That's like, that's not, yeah.
Okay, so the goal is, okay, let's put it this way. You have until 2:45 for lunch, okay? But you need to select your responsive thing. And,
Mom and Dad are real close.
What's your first name?
okay, Mr. Saunders.
What are you're doing city liaison?
Anyway, okay, Checker.
I'm a Florida cracker.
Right, she's the overlord.
Yeah, she's old.
Okay.
I'm the neighborhood guy, the used car salesman.
You look like a neighborhood.
Hey, if I got a deal for you, this development's gonna be great for you. Hey, you're just gonna have to move about 2 miles down. You
Don't
won't
worry
be
about the spinning thing. They won't cut you.
Yeah. Birds, oh yeah. There's little noise, you get used to it.
Think about airports.
Just a little noise.
No, I have like a right now.
What are you thinking? I got time?
That's free. You know what that guy?
Ryan.
Yeah.
I want me too.
Comfort neighborhood.
So she can wear though.
You are
You can say that.
Which one?
sitting the
Sierra. Okay.
Not so much emphasis on the
Where are you going for sushi?
No, I'm walking. You can't drive. You could, but there's no parking.
Talk about the projects over lunch. Be productive.
What? Be productive.
When will this be, when will we initiate this second part of the project? When will it start?
Now,
So we working on both projects at the same time? Okay.
Yeah.